As landmen, there are some considerations you need to think there when you are working with your client on a battery storage project.
The battery is a fairly simple prospect compared to, let's say, wind turbines, where you've got these like massive structures. But that's not to say it's totally foolproof.
The size of a project is really dictated by the project and energy capacity that you're looking for.
Safety in batteries is a really critical topic.
And interconnection varies by region. Getting your project in the door, usually there's a queue that you got to sign into.
One of the beauties of a battery is that it can do a lot of different services. It's a very quick growing field.
Landmen, we get involved when the phone rings and people need us to go out and do land capture and title and all the support kind of leading up to construction. These guys have a great understanding of a lot of the whys and hows and like the technical side of these projects.
We are actually sitting with the guys that wrote the best book.
I'd venture to say that they might have the best BESS book out there. Is impressive.
Welcome to the Land Department Podcast. The state of land and energy as we see it.
Brent, I'm glad you got the memo on what shirt to wear to work today. We look fairly similar. Yeah, I forgot to shave and just leave the mustache, but we're both.
Well, we all know I'm winning the mustache contest right now.
Yes, you would absolutely win. No, that's great.
You kids start calling you one of the Mario brothers. You know you're getting there. You're getting there.
Man, well, I'm excited for this episode today. Like, what was it, a month ago or so, we sat down with Natalie and everyone else that's working on renewables project at Dudley and talked about BESS 101. And we are actually sitting with the guys that wrote the BESS book and excited to kind of dive deeper into battery energy storage and really at a deeper level conversation than what we had.
I'd venture to say that they might have the best BESS book out there because this puppy is impressive. It's a deep dive. And I think, we were talking about wanting to do just talk about battery storage and the land side of things. And then ran across Drew on LinkedIn of all places. That's where we get all our contacts now these days. It's a great resource. And he was talking about a book that they wrote. And I thought it'd be great to have Drew and his guys on. He brought in Sean to talk about some of the technical side of things. Landmen, we get involved when the phone rings and people need us to go out and do land capture and title and all the support kind of leading up to construction and all the regulatory things that happen. These guys have a great understanding of a lot of the whys and hows and like the technical side of these projects. So I thought it'd be great to have them on and have them share their experience. So Drew and Sean, thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having us. I think we both run across real estate as a key piece of what we do. And you cannot build a project unless you have a piece of land to put it on. And sometimes that can make or break a project. So really great to share a little bit about the industry where it's now. And it's a very quick growing field, as I'm sure you and your listeners know. So it's been a privilege to be in this field for the past several years. And I'm really excited to see where it goes, both from a land perspective and just from the technology in general.
No doubt. We know it's going to be evolving. Sean, why don't you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves and kind of your backgrounds and what led you to this point to really do a deep dive and put a book out there. I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of value out of.
So Sean Daly here, project design engineer for Acacia Energy, which is an Australian company, about 5 gigawatt hour pipeline and growing in Australia, also getting projects going in Japan and of course here in the US. I'm part of the US development arm. I've actually only been in energy storage for a few years now. I came from the wind side, working at DNV for 10 years, testing wind turbines. Then met Drew and he convinced me that energy storage was the future and brought me on board. And somehow I ended up here writing a book with him. They're based out of Portland, Oregon. And it's been a fun ride.
And I'm Drew Lebowitz. I am the principal and managing director of Power Switch. We're an energy storage consulting firm working with developers of energy storage projects. But we also work with companies that are actually manufacturing the products, We work with utilities that are buying the services that come from these energy storage plants. So really, we get to touch a lot of different aspects of the industry. I'm also an alumni of DNV, the Norwegian energy consulting firm, where Sean used to work. Also, Shweta Sundaram, who is our other co-author. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but she is also an alum of DNV. So we all have gone in different directions. Shweta now works for RWE, which is an international developer of energy storage projects, and she's based there in Austin. So coming at the industry from a few different perspectives, it was a long journey. It took almost 4 years from the conception of the project to the publication, which happened earlier this year. But it was great bringing Shweta and Sean on board, kind of having a real solid team to tackle this subject, which, as you can see from the book, it is a pretty broad technology for everything from the cell all the way to how these get built and the markets and the finance that's behind it.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So I guess let's dive into it. We kind of just really we talked before about some kind of key things that kind of tell the story of these projects, and as you mentioned, it starts with real estate. What are kind of what dictates the size of a project? Maybe if you can dive into just the types of battery storage projects you might see, and what dictates more size or less size. Give us the breakdown.
The size of a project is really dictated by the project and energy capacity that you're looking for. And a lot of that is dependent on how the system is being used. You'll hear people talk about 2-hour and 4-hour battery systems. And essentially that'll drive the megawatt hours that the project needs. The more megawatt hours, the bigger the project's got to be. These projects are a lot smaller than wind and solar projects, right? They're not very land intensive relative to those. My company, Acacia, is building the world's most powerful battery right now down in Australia, outside of Sydney. It's an 850 megawatt project, almost 1.7 gigawatt hours. So it's a 2-hour project. That project's only taken up about 32 acres. That 32 acres means you've got an energy density of about 50 megawatt hours per acre, which is probably on the lower side of the industry these days, which is driven by what technology you're using, which battery inverter supplier you're using. That scales a lot depending on supplier, and then 4-hour duration. You also have to consider the project substation, right? You need to get your voltages up to transmission level. And then you may also need to have your utility substation on the land as well. So you might have 2 substations. So 50 megawatt hours is on the lower side these days. For some other technologies, and with battery energy densities getting higher and higher, they just keep going up. You can get up to 100 megawatt hours per acre, which is impressive. So you can have these, huge projects. Warta's the most powerful in the world, one of the biggest in the world in terms of megawatt hours, and that's only 32 acres. So you can see, sizes after that, 15 to 20 acres. So much easier than building wind and solar.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So what's the line of sight on that? I mean, right, we've seen battery technology in general, I think over the last 5 years, improve so much, just in the things that everyday things that we use, right? What's the line of sight for that in the battery storage game? Do we think it'll get twice as good in the next 5 years or 10 years? I mean, there's so much attention and so much technology and so much brain power going toward it. What are we seeing?
Yeah, that's a great question. The technology has evolved exponentially over the past few years. So just real quick timeline. It started in 1991 was when lithium ion was invented. And that technology was one of many different technologies that were out there. They started showing up in power tools and watches. Consumer electronics was kind of the first place you started seeing it. But it really wasn't quite to prime time in terms of the technology until about 2012, 2012 to 2015 is when we started seeing these utility scale batteries that could actually connect to the power grid. And that was when lithium ion really started to kind of separate itself from the pack in terms of showing it as a technology that had the energy density. So, like Sean was saying, how much energy can you pack into a certain area? Also, round trip efficiency is a big one. That refers to how much energy you get out of the battery after you put a certain amount in. You can never get it all out, as you know, but it used to be that you put 100 kilowatt hours into a battery and you might get, say, 75 or 80 kilowatt hours back. Nowadays, the round trip efficiency has gotten so good that it's upwards of 90% on the high voltage level, meaning if you put that same 100 kilowatt hours in, now you get 90 kilowatt hours back. So all those numbers continuing to improve. Densities are going up. Round trip efficiency is getting better and better. And then other factors such as safety, batteries are getting safer and safer. There is a theoretical maximum, like just based on that chemistry. We do see that like there's a ceiling, but we think we're still a long ways away from that. Used to be that a 20-foot container of batteries would be somewhere around 2 megawatt hours. Then it started to be 3, 4, 5. Now the latest ones are 6 or even up to 7 megawatt hours in that same 20-foot container. So you're really just seeing those densities go up and up.
Yeah, I mean, what we tend to see a lot of the battery storage projects that we do here in Texas, across the U.S., they're 10 to 50 acre projects as far as land capture that we're looking for. Now, ultimately, what it turns into constructed is another thing. But to your point, Sean, you know, not only do you have the batteries themselves, but you got substations and all supporting type technology that goes into running those. What does that look like other than, you think the container, right? What supporting structures are needed around these types of projects to make them tick?
Yeah, great question. So from the container, depending on the technology, and actually this is something that also drives project land density, is certain suppliers need an inverter, a power conversion system external to the container. There are some suppliers where those inverters are integrated in the container. And I think we're seeing some more of that in the industry. So that'll decrease the density now that you don't have to have this external power conversion system. Then you need to have your medium voltage transformers to get up to medium voltage. That'll run to your substation where you've got your high voltage transformer, your big circuit breakers. That's all contained within the project substation. And, all the bus work that goes with that. Then depending on if you can land your project next to a substation or existing switchyard, then you don't have to build that substation, right? That's the utility substation. You don't have to consider it. You might need to do some upgrades, build another bay. But if you can't build next to a substation, now you have to have the utility build their substation, usually within your project land. So you're looking at 2 substations, and it's generally just the utility circuit breakers and connecting to the transmission.
How much footprint does that substation typically need to take up from your land project? We're talking about setting aside an acre, 2 acres for workspace and all the things.
Yeah, up to a few acres.
Yeah.
Yeah, substation, you will have to have a control building, operations building, storage for spares, and parking. Gotta have that parking.
Yeah.
It's important to some of the roadway requirements because I'm sure we'll get into this later, but safety in batteries is a really critical topic. There have been some notable safety incidents. Luckily, most of these facilities are not staffed usually, so you have that little safer in that you don't have people there at the facility often. But you have to have a certain distance between the containers. You have to have usually clusters of containers have to have roadways between them. And that's both for safety purposes and for if you, let's say, had a transformer go out, you'd have to, bring in a crane. And so, there needs to be a certain working distance. That varies a little bit from supplier to supplier, but everyone has some requirements for roadways on the project site.
What about noise considerations? This is a very elementary question, but in land, oftentimes footprint and workspace and things like that are accountable, or functions of making sure you've got enough room for noise suppression when you're in, say, highly domesticated areas, closer to cities, residential areas. Are there what's the consideration there for a battery storage project?
Yeah, there are a lot of noise considerations. It varies from market to market. You have certain markets where, first of all, if the facilities are being built, way out in the countryside in the middle of cornfields, it's usually less of a concern. And some markets have stricter rules than others. For example, I'm working on a project now in Ontario, Canada, and they have very strict requirements to the point where I can't remember the exact decibel level, but it's like I looked up the equivalent. It was like the sound level you'd find in a quiet library is what they require, only about 100 feet away. So the component that generates the most noise on the battery system is typically the inverter, and that's mainly driven by the cooling fans that are inside of the inverter. Sean mentioned now some battery products are bringing the inverter right into the battery container, so usually that can cut the noise down a little bit. But on projects like the one in Ontario, or any market where noise is a key concern, especially as you mentioned, Brent, if you're like next to a residential area, that's really important. A lot of noise modeling has to be done. So you'll get a noise model for the individual inverter or battery, and then that will contribute to a noise study that will determine how many decibels are going to be experienced at a certain level. And in general, the goal is to shoot the sound up, so try to get your noise to go straight up rather than out, because that'll just reduce the amount of noise that the neighbors or whoever ends up hearing.
And I haven't seen this in the US yet, but in Australia, we've actually had a project or two where there were very strict noise requirements, and we had to build a sound wall to block the noise, which can add a couple million to a big project, but definitely a concern.
Well, we see that, the reason I asked about noise is just space, right? Footprint of your land acquisition efforts. If you have a 10-acre project, but you can find 20 acres that's suitable, it's much cheaper to buy potentially 10 additional acres or 20 additional acres in some instances than to have to buy, build $2 million wall, right? Noise suppression and things like that. So those are all considerations, things we deal with in land capture for oil and gas, a number of different energy projects that we do, all considerations and that affect how big of a footprint you might need. And I think that kind of leads us to the next thing we want to maybe progress into, is just talking about the location of the projects. Do you locate them closer to substations, as Drew mentioned earlier, or do you get them into more of the load centers, around larger cities and things? What do you see? I think, are there different companies that target different types of battery storage projects? What's the story there?
Yeah, well, I think everybody's trying to get land next to
Everywhere.
substations. Right, that can be out remote, away from the cities. It can be closer to the load centers, but you do want to be as close as possible as that substation, because that substation is your network, that everything else around you. The more lines coming in and out of that substation, the more potential to, either charge your project or discharge. If you're not next to the substation, right, maybe you're between substations, what you want to do is build a line tap where you're right on the transmission line, again, as close as possible, so that your gen tie, the way you connect to the transmission line, is as short as possible, right? The further you are from the substation, the more line you have, the more potential for failure. Right? If for a line tap, you basically have two ways to get, out to the two connecting substations. So if one goes down, you're left with one line. If your actual gen tie goes down, the longer that is, right, the more potential for it to fail. Then you're out until it can be fixed. But yeah, you really want to be next to the substations. The more they're connected, the more opportunities to move electricity, right? And hopefully there's less congestion and costs, right? The longer your gen tie, the higher your costs are. So yeah, everyone's fighting to buy up land right next to substations where there's still open base or room for expansion, room for more base to be built so they can just tap right in. Of course, you got to look at, well, what other projects are around? How congested is that substation? Is there actually headroom to put more transmission on there? Are there planned upgrades so there will be more headroom? Those are all things to consider from the technical side of moving electricity. I'll hand it to Drew to discuss more of the market.
Sure. So all these projects we're talking about are investments, right? So no one's going to build these out of the goodness of their heart. They're building them because they're going to use these facilities to generate revenues. Those revenues have to be sufficient to offset the capex, the expense to build the battery itself, and then the opex, the cost to run the battery. So you're always going after some type of market, and batteries are unique in that they can access all kinds of different markets. Some of the more common ones might be arbitrage. So just, let's say buying power in the middle of the day where you're near solar. Power is cheap if you're in that type of market. Charge the battery, then the sun goes down, power prices go up, you discharge the battery. Just simple buy low, sell high mentality, and the batteries can make huge revenues that way. But there are other cases such as what we call frequency regulation. And that's like you would float the battery at 50% state of charge. So you're halfway charged or discharged. And then sometimes if there's, say, too much load on the system, the frequency will start dropping. So in the US, we're on 60 hertz. You might go down to 59.9. And then you would have, the battery, the utility would say, hey, we need some more power. You would inject that power and bring the frequency back up to 60 hertz. Or conversely, if there was overproduction, your frequency might be 60.1. And so you need to actually pull power off of the grid. And so the battery can do either of those things. So these are just a couple examples of different markets you're going after. And depending on the market, that's going to determine where you want to put the facility. So for certain types of markets, let's say like that solar example I gave, obviously you want to be close to solar. Right now, California is a really hot market for that because they have they put so much solar onto the grid, they actually have a bit of overproduction of solar. So very low prices in the daytime, but sun goes down, all that solar comes offline, it becomes a great opportunity for batteries. So that's going to kind of dictate the geography that you'll go after with this type of system. And then within, say, a market like California, then you'd look at, okay, does it make sense to put it rurally? Like obviously from a land perspective, if you can keep away from the cities and cheaper land, that's just going to be better for your financial model. But there are some cases where you're chasing a market. I was working on one in New York City where they really needed to, because of the way the market functioned, they had to be very close to the substation in the city. In other words, you're buying land in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country or the world, and that becomes a huge chunk of the project price, but that's built into their financial model. And that's going to allow them to chase those higher revenues, higher profits, and justify the higher land price.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's really a market drives where these projects tend to go. We see it in different places. Like I'm in Houston, right? And we had a big battery storage push in town, and everybody was chasing the same substations, and we were getting calls every other week. And the clients would send us 20 substations, and 10 of them we'd already worked. And so that makes a lot of sense. It's the land grab is what we've all experienced over the last 12 to 18 months to get the real estate next to these substations. But now we're starting to see more of our rural solar development clients that we've put these solar projects together. They're starting to look at maybe taking their projects where we've secured 600 acres and they're wanting to carve out potentially 30, 40, 50 acres of battery storage development, or battery storage clients have us chasing offset properties next to solar facilities. So that makes sense. That kind of helps us understand as landmen, why are we in town versus why are we out chasing, maybe these offsetting projects. That makes a lot of sense. Cool.
I'm curious about the intersection. We haven't really talked about that much in our last episode on BESS, but Can you walk us through kind of the main steps of the interconnection process for these projects, and maybe even share the timeline as you go through those steps?
Yeah. So interconnection is big. There are long timelines these days, which I'll talk a little bit about. And interconnection is exactly that, the process of connecting your project to transmission. It varies by region. There's different ISOs, RTOs that you have to play within, different regions of the US, but they all follow the same general process of applying, getting your project in the door. Usually there's a queue or a wait list that you get assigned to. ERCOT's famous for not having a queue position. And ERCOT is in Texas. CAISO, the California ISO, is notorious for their long wait list. Once you're in that queue, you start doing technical screenings and studies. You want to see what the facility is going to look like, how it connects technically, short circuit of the grid. You do a steady state study, look at grid stability, right? All these engineering studies, looking at power flow models. And the details, kind of requirements will vary by region there. Once all that's dialed in, you work on an interconnection agreement with the transmission service provider, TSP, or the utility. And then you're locked in. Then it's time to really move forward and build the project. So moving into design, starting procurement. Procurement's another big timeline risk right now because the high voltage transformers and high voltage circuit breakers have long lead times, up to 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. So another reason, along with the interconnection timeline, which I'll touch on shortly, to get ahead of this process. After design, procurement, construction, now you're into commissioning, inspections, getting final sign off from the ISO, and moving into operation and maintenance. So again, the process varies a bit by the different regions, but generally about the same. ERCOT, the Texas ISO, is currently the shortest. I think you can get down to about 3 years. Maybe if you're really lucky and you have those long lead items ahead of time, might be able to get online in 2 years. ISO is probably the California ISO 4, maybe really worst case 7 years. Some of that is due to issues that come up with the project, not necessarily the queue. And for all regions right now, FERC is really pushing for reform. They just came out with a new order in May of 2024 that's really pushing to increase the efficiency of the interconnection process. It's increasing fees and cancellation costs, trying to knock out people who are just sitting in the interconnection queue, maybe not totally ready to build the project, but they're trying to get in line so that they're there when they are ready. So that's really having a big effect on costs and queue timelines. But I think it's going to be the best for the industry going forward. Yeah, anywhere from 3 to 5+ years.
We seeing that increase, like cause a time increase. The recent FERC adjustments is obviously to reduce that timeline and weed out people who don't need to be in the queue. But has that increased your cost? And what kind of ways do we anticipate that?
Yep. Increased costs, increased cancellation fees. So if you get in the queue and you're sitting there and you're like, oh, hey, we got to pull out. We can't do this. You now have to pay more to pull out. But it looks like it's already clearing up the queues and decreasing timelines. So I think it's a positive effect overall, but you got to really be ready to pay to play.
Sean,
they don't want anyone lollygagging.
How does that compare to Australia, where you guys are doing projects at your company? What is the global comparison to our timelines here?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because Australia can't believe the long lead item timeline. So that's huge. I think Australia can probably get a project online in about a year.
Wow.
The interconnection process, especially the technical aspects, the power flow models, and the grid requirements are much more stringent they put a lot more time and money into modeling the grid there. I think the Australian grid's a bit weaker. And because the country is so big and spread out, they really have to be sure that they're not messing up the transmission. Costs vary a lot in the US. So I think on average costs are probably about the same. But yeah, that can change a lot depending on region.
Wow.
Yeah, one
Man,
thing
so
I think
interesting.
one thing I think it's important to underline is that energy storage is a very regulatory driven business, meaning that you have areas of the country, so California and Texas being prime examples, or other parts of the world, Australia, UK, South Korea, where the markets create conditions where energy storage really can shine. But you have other parts of the world or the country where the technology is the same, the grid is very similar, but the markets are designed in ways where energy storage does not get the rewards that are available in some other markets. And that affects everything from the amount of revenues that you have on the project, to that interconnection timeline, to the studies that you have to run. So I think there's a lot of push in the industry, everything from these short orders to state incentives and state marketplaces that should be set up. That a lot of the companies, both developers, manufacturers, and others in the industry, they're pushing to try to push these markets forward, because the tech is there, it can offer these benefits, but only if the markets and the rules allow for it to come online.
Yeah, I think that's, as an industry, everybody's pushing toward that, right? I think with the industry and innovation will take us as far as we want it to. We just have to get out of our way. I think that's we're get out of our own ways from a regulatory standpoint. So I think we'll all see that, and we all hope that we'll continue to see that progression forward and get this to be a much more efficient project. Because to Sean's point, you can get this done in a year. It doesn't have to take 7 or 8. So hopefully we'll start to see some of the parts of the country that are a little more progressive, the ERCOTs, and that at least get it done in 3 years, maybe start to set the model for other ISOs to follow.
I did want to also point out that most of what we've been talking about so far is focused on projects where you're selling services either to the ISO, RTO, or the utility. But there are a lot of projects that are out there that have what we would call corporate off-taker, meaning that you have an entity that's buying the services that isn't necessarily the utility or the ISO. And a big example of that is something like data centers. We have
Yes.
Obviously a huge growth in that sector. They're massive consumers of power, but sometimes they procure land, and they may have the land, they may have the ability to connect. But if they want to draw a certain amount of power to run their facility, the utility might say, hey, you got to wait 3 or 4 years, or pay however many millions of dollars, things that can become barriers to the project. So another route is to say, we're going to put solar or batteries or a combination of those on site. And that way we won't have to have as big a pipe feeding us power from the utility. And in that case, you may be doing both. You maybe have let's say a big data center developer, let's say Meta or Google or someone, might be buying part of the services you sell, and another part might be going to one of these markets. But that's a real growing sector for revenue stream for battery projects.
We're starting to see some of that data center type land sourcing as well in the land world. So yeah, it's all evolving, and they're going to find ways to leverage this. So we're excited to kind of see where that takes us as well from the land side of things. But it's very much the data center where it's partnered with renewables companies who are doing solar, who are doing battery. So it all has a place for sure. What are we talked about the kind of the interconnection lead times, why these projects take so long. That's the 5 or 6 year potential timeline is often why we tend to buy these parcels as opposed to lease them. So when we do lease, it's long-term lease agreements, but the obvious goal is outright purchase. If you've got land, you've got opportunities to partner with other groups. If you own that land outright, you can partner with other groups, you can sell off, you can have future development. You can expand your operations. So the kind of industry common accepted way of going about land capture from what we see is outright purchase. But as landmen, there are some considerations you need to think there when you maybe are working with your clients on a battery storage project. If you're negotiating for the purchase of land, different states are going to have different laws and regulations about licensing, so landmen typically aren't licensed realtors. So if you're a landman doing that kind of work, you need to be real careful about what you're doing, how you're going about those discussions, and when you maybe hand things over to a realtor on your team or to someone directly in-house who may be negotiating those purchases, because that can monkey up a process early on. That's already a long process, and you don't want to cause any delay there. So big consideration for us on the land side. Beyond that, what are with construction of these projects and maintenance and long-term operational maintenance, what are some of the civil concerns that you need to deal with or be factoring in? Obviously, you talk about Houston. Houston, you don't think is, being flooded all the time, but we have hurricanes now and 500-year floods every 5 years, it seems. What are some considerations there that you guys see?
Well, from a civil perspective, a battery is a fairly simple prospect compared to, let's say wind turbines, where you've got these like massive structures. At its heart, a battery is a very heavy box, which sits usually on a concrete pad. So it's fairly simple, but that's not to say it's totally foolproof. There are still a lot of concerns you have to think of from a civil perspective. So the first would be geotech, meaning geotechnical engineering. As part of the process, you're coming in, doing boreholes, trying to figure out what the character of that subsurface is. Do you have real sandy soils or clay soils or whatever the case may be? And that's going to determine what type of foundation you'll need for these battery containers, and also the containers for the inverters or the substation, all the other components that go into the system. The two big classes that we see of foundations are either pile-driven foundations, meaning steel piles that are driven into the ground, and then you'll set your containers on top of those, or concrete foundations, meaning just a concrete pad that's poured. In either case, most common is you'll have a stub up, meaning conduits are buried underground so that they can run the cabling and the conductors right into the containers themselves. So those are the two most common. We are starting to see some providers, some energy storage products that would allow for them to be set on a compacted foundation. So, the civil conditions would have to be just right, or the soil conditions would have to be just right. But clearly, like if you're able to compact the land and then set the container down, and in some cases, not even use conduits, but to use above ground raceways or ways to get your cables around between the containers. Obviously, that can save a lot, both in cost and in timeline for construction of the projects. But it's not every jurisdiction that allows that, and it's not every product that allows for it either. So those are the biggest concerns when it comes to the geotechnical. But also, as you mentioned, flooding is a big concern. So typically for each of these parcels, you'll have to do a study to look at, okay, what's the most common rainfall we'll experience? I was working on a project in Taiwan where they have typhoons, so where the hurricanes that come through, they can dump, several inches of rain within a course of a few minutes. And so then you've got to study, okay, if that were to happen, how's the water going to get off the site? Are we going to have to grade it in a certain way or have retention ponds? All those are parts of the concern that influence whether a parcel will be a good fit for energy storage, or if you have to do a certain amount of work to get it to where it's in good shape to be a battery project.
How do these, and I think about this, we obviously just had, Hurricane Beryl here in Houston, and the substation next to my house had a foot of water, standing over it. How do these projects withhold, standing water if they get water penetration? Is that a done, battery storage project? Do you have to completely rebuild, or are you only replacing certain battery components within that container? How's if the worst happens on your project, Mother Nature wise, how does that come into play?
So the first avenue would be prevent that from happening. So that involves picking the right parcel, and then picking the right foundation system. So for example, those pile-driven systems I talk about that sometimes can get your containers a couple feet above grade. Which if you're 5 feet of water, it's not going to make a difference. But if you have a foot of water, that can maybe make the difference on that site between your containers being submerged or not. The vast majority of the products in the marketplace have an IP rating, meaning that's ingress protection, meaning they have certain seals and whatnot. If you're in, say, a marine area where you have salty air, it may have to be a higher level than if you're not. They generally are not designed ever to have standing water, and if you were to ever have that condition, usually the site, first of all, would power down. One thing that's unique to batteries is that on the cell or the module level, you can disconnect the individual components of a battery, but ultimately you've got a lot of energy stored there with a big positive and a negative terminal. And if you ever to have water get in there, that of course could be a huge fire risk or a short risk. And you can provide fusing and other protective devices. But if you were to have that happen, I think I haven't worked on a project directly that's had that problem. But I've heard of some that had water coming in. Most cases it was from bad rainstorm where there wasn't that proper sealing, meaning that you didn't, somehow water was getting in. And in that case, you really have to send inspectors in to kind of test either module by module or rack by rack to see what components have been affected. But it's simply going to take that system offline for a good amount of time. And all that's, time that the system's not using and not earning its revenue. It gets into insurance, which is a big question of, can you insure both the product itself and the project as a whole against different types of natural disasters?
Yeah. Well, just natural disaster was like fresh on my mind. I brought that part up. What's the, what are the obviously these projects are all the values there. We've talked about all that. What's the market? Like, what's the revenue generator model of this? Like, how does that come together? So I know we talked earlier, like merchant and contract revenue models. Like, what is that?
Yeah. So in general, there's kind of two big buckets you could think of ways that batteries can make money. So I referenced a few of them before, things like frequency regulation or arbitrage. But in general, you either have a contract for that revenue, meaning you've signed on the dotted line with, let's say, a utility that says, we want to have the battery on call so that in the summer months, if we had an event where there was a real heat wave, which is something that really stresses the grid. As we know, everyone's got their air conditioning cranked up to the max. Power plants might be failing. The governor might be telling everybody to turn their AC off. So the utility or the ISO wants to have a contract with different providers to say, we can call on you in those real critical times to inject some power into the grid, reducing demand, decreasing the likelihood there's going to be, a brownout or a blackout in worst case scenario. So those are services that are contracted with the utility or ISO. And in a lot of cases, they may pay you year round, even though most of the time it's going to happen in the summer. But year round, they're paying you to say, at any given point in time, we want you to charge up your battery the night before and then discharge usually in those peak hours. And so that's one revenue stream you're getting, which would be a contract revenue stream. You've signed for the life of the project. Most of the projects we work on are 20 or now sometimes 25-year projects. So someone's committed for that whole period to pay you a certain amount of money. On the other hand, there may be services that you can provide, like in Texas, it's an energy-based market. And so you have times when that energy, price can spike way up. Also tends to happen in those peak periods, but you can kind of play that market. That's what we call merchant revenue streams. And those different from contract because nobody's saying, we're going to pay you a certain amount. You're just saying you have to meet some technical requirements to play in the market. But once you're in the market, it's up to you of how you make your money. So you may be saying, okay, for the financial model, everyone's putting together a huge spreadsheet of how the battery will work. let's say 50% of the revenues that this project is going to make are contracted. There's no doubt that we're going to get paid those because the utility has said we will pay you for them. But another 50% might be we're out there playing these energy markets, and those differ quite a bit from state to state or from region to region. But the central idea is by participating in that market, you have an expectation you're going to be able to make some revenues. Sometimes you have a good month in the summer where, there's been a lot of these events and you're able to make a huge amount of your revenue in a short period of time. Other times you may have bad market conditions where, let's say, you thought you'd be the only battery in that county, but all of a sudden 5 other projects have come on. And so you're chasing the same amount of revenue and it might be below expectations. But in general, those are the 2 ways batteries can make money, either contracted revenue streams or merchant markets.
And you can see a battery project, to your point, play both sides. Like they can allocate X amount of their project to committed contract revenues, and then they can play the markets with the other part of their project.
That's right. One of the beauties of a battery is that I mentioned it can do a lot of different services, like, this frequency regulation or arbitrage, or you can even do things like black start, meaning like the ability to start up the grid if the grid has gone out. And so all these things are different services, and some of those it can do with them at the same time, which is a little counterintuitive to think about. But I think the best way to think about it is a project like what Acacia, Sean's company, is doing, this huge battery project. You might have a certain part of the project is doing this one activity, and another part of the project is doing another activity. And both of those are making money at the same time. One of them might be contract revenues. The other might be merchant, or maybe they're all one or all the other. But one of the nice things about energy storage is you can do what we call revenue stacking. So like those things are happening simultaneously, meeting those market conditions and making money for the project.
Fantastic.
Wow. Very interesting.
Well, you enlightened the landman for the day.
Yeah, you definitely did. I want to make sure that, we've already mentioned the book. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. People can buy it on Amazon, and it is thorough. It can answer really any questions anybody has. I'm certain of it after looking at it. But how can people get in touch with you? And where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm happy to have people reach out over LinkedIn. Sean Daly at Acacia. Send me a message, connect, and let's chat.
Same here. I think LinkedIn is an amazing platform for those types of connections. So you can find me on there, myself, Drew Lebowitz, or also under Power Switch, which is the energy storage consulting firm that I lead. We really try to get a lot of posts out there, both things about the book or also just kind of key topics in energy storage. And I'm always open to meet new folks in the industry, even though, we wrote this book, which was a tremendous learning process. I think in writing the book, we learned a lot. There's new things happening every day, new technology coming out, new markets coming online, new business models. So always open to meet new folks that are working in the space.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely link to all those things in the show notes, including the LinkedIn's if people want an easy way to find you. There's a lot of questions we weren't even able to get to today, and so many different things that we couldn't cover, but we have more answers after this episode with you guys. So thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge, everything that you've learned up to date. And I'm sure that there's going to be even more to learn in the future as this industry continues to grow. So thank you both for your time. And maybe in the future, if there's huge, significant updates in the industry, we'd love to have you back.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Take care.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks for listening to The Land Department. Check out our website in the show notes or visit dudley-land.com to learn more about us.